Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Transformative Movement Building webinar series. My name is Mimi Ho, and I'm the co-director at the Movement Strategy Center, and we're thrilled to be co-hosting this with the Move to End Violence program. While we're getting started, and just another moment to join us, take a look. If you're joined on through the webinar platform, there's a question on the screen that you can reflect on while we're getting started, and you can share via chat. What is one movement that has impacted your life in a real way? And give one word or phrase about how your life is different because of that movement. We're thrilled to be seeing folks from all across the country, from different movements in the movements to end gender violence, from queer movements, from all kinds. I'm looking at from the National Domestic Violence Hotline. There's people from all over the place and all over the country. We also have people who are from various other movements joining us today. Thank you for the cross-learning we're about to embark on. Take a couple minutes and we're going to get started. It is fantastic to see so many people from across the country joining us. Many people from various movements to end gender-based violence. And we also have folks from outside of those movements. We have climate, movement for Black lives, undocumented youth. We have an amazing array of people from across the country, and we're excited to be doing cross-learning with you. My name is Mimi Ho, and I am the co-director at Movement Strategy Center, and I will be your MC this morning. Really excited to be seeing virtually, being connected with you all virtually across technology like this. We're excited to do this webinar series, and we're gonna get started. So welcome to our Movement Building webinar series. Thanks so much for joining us today. We are going to take just a moment, and this is the first of 6 webinars on the topic of transformative movement building. And it is a collaboration between the Movement Strategy Center and the Move to End Violence. Again, my name is Mimi Ho, and I'm the co-director at Movement Strategy Center, and I'll be your MC. We're especially excited to present this series. Movement Strategy Center has been a longtime partner of the Move to End Violence, a program of the Novo Foundation that aims to strengthen leaders, organizations, and the movement as a whole, working to end violence against all girls and women. And over the years of this very important partnership, we have informed and shaped work. And we have learned and been in beloved community with many of you who are on the webinar today. We thank you for your partnership. This series is an opportunity to share this work with all of you and to have it live and grow with you. And we want to share this with anyone who is interested in building powerful movements for social change. We hope these webinars will introduce some shared language and concepts and help spark more conversations about the kind of movement we need and how we'll get there. Today's webinar kicks off a 6-part series. Today's webinar is an overview of what we mean when we say transformative movements. Each of the future webinars will go deeper into a particular area. So today, to help provide some perspective, we are enlisting help from a sister movement, the Movement for Food Justice. Future webinars, which will go into more detail on the different aspects of transformative movement building, will feature stories from the movement to end violence against girls and women. Our learning objectives for today. We are developing concepts and practice to support movement building. And we are highlighting inspiring examples of transformative movement building, introducing 4 elements of transformative movement building that come together when we develop strategy for transformation. So before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. We are recording. You will be able to request from the Move to End Violence website in the next day or so. We've also reserved question and answer time at the end. But there are other ways for you to participate before then, especially if you're connected through the webinar platform. In the upper left-hand corner of your screen, you'll see options. Q&A. This allows you to ask a question directly of the panelists, and we'll be keeping an eye on these throughout the session. We'll also return to these questions during our Q&A at the end. The chat function, which many of you have already familiarized yourselves with, you can use this feature to communicate in real time with everyone on the webinar or specific people and panelists. And for those of you on social media, you can use transformative movements. So for today, we are very fortunate to have a fantastic movement builder, Navina Khanna, with us today. She is the director of Heal Food Alliance, which stands for Health, Environment, Agriculture, and Labor. She and they have been on an incredible journey of transformative movement building towards a more just, healthy, and sustainable food movement. And they're building with folks who care about health, the environment, agriculture, and labor to redefine the food justice movement and to build a more just, healthy, and sustainable food system. First, however, I'm going to turn things over to my dear co-director at the Movement Strategy Center, Taj James, who will give us some more context about transformative movement building. Taj.
Thanks, Mimi. And thank you all for joining us for this conversation today. We are living at a truly unique moment in history. It's a moment in which the crises that we face as communities and as humanity sometimes have never felt more daunting. And today we want to honor Sandra Bland. We want to honor Tamir Rice. We want to honor Terrence Crutcher, who joined the ancestors last week, because for many of us in this moment in history, our struggle is just to breathe. Our struggle is just to breathe, and that struggle has never felt more intense than it does today. So I want to honor those ancestors and bring them into our conversation today. Men, women, and children, women, and men who've left us too soon. We want to honor also those great protectors of the land and the water and Mother Earth at Standing Rock, who are putting their bodies on the line for all of us and for future generations. In the midst of these crises, we can feel both great despair and great inspiration at the courage that's come forward. But what all of this is telling me and telling us here in our community is that despite the crisis we face, the opportunities and the possibilities for deep transformation in many ways have never been greater. And the transformative movements of today are rising to meet this challenge and this opportunity in deeply courageous and innovative ways. And this moment is so exciting to me personally, because for many years, social change movements in this country were very, very stuck in the muck. And I know because I grew up right in the middle of it. I was a movement baby of the early 70s who grew up as a part of the community organizing tradition, and my peers and I thought we knew a lot about movement building. We thought we knew a lot about social change. And as we worked with young people and families to win victories, to end the school to prison pipeline, we were working to keep police officers out of our schools and to get nurses and after-school programs into our schools. And we thought that all of those small victories were adding up to bigger and deeper change. But when we talked to the families and the young people that we work with, and we asked them if their lives were getting better or worse, were they getting easier or harder, without question, without exception, those families told us that it was getting harder and harder to just get by. And that caused me and many of my other colleagues to start to question how we define success. If we were winning, but people said their lives were getting worse, then maybe we needed to think about the depth of change that we were seeking, the depth of transformation that we were seeking in much deeper and more fundamental ways, if we were going to really create a world in which there's true dignity and justice for all. So now we're living in a moment of profoundly transformative movement building that is both as bold and innovative as our crises are deep and interconnected. And within that, transformational movements are growing and evolving in all kinds of different ways, helping us to reconnect to ourselves and reconnect to each other and reconnect to our sense of the whole. Social movements are a unique approach to social change, and they're powerful because they can solve problems that are bigger than any one person or one organization can address alone. Movements help us to wake up to the ways that we may have become numb or blind or silent or complacent and sometimes complicit in accepting the unacceptable. And they are transformational fundamentally because they make the impossible possible. Movements do this sometimes by just helping us to win access to our most basic fundamental rights. The right for our children to play in the park and not fear that they will be killed by the police. The right to our babies to drink the water in our homes without fear that they will be poisoned and experience irreparable harm because that water is filled with lead. The right of a woman to simply be safe in her home from violence. These are our most basic and fundamental rights, and our transformative movement's first work is to fight and struggle for our basic access to those rights. But these same movements often step forward to fundamentally reimagine what is possible, to find ways to bring those new possibilities to life, like the work of Mobilize the Immigrant Vote, who in partnership with Culture Strike are imagining a racially just world free of bars and borders. Transformative movements express both the assertion of basic rights, the right to breathe, the right to move freely, the right to communicate, and they insist that another world is possible, another world is on the way, another world is emerging. And within this, there's one question that we must all ask ourselves. How deep is the change we seek? We've learned through our partnership with movement builders over the last 15 years that for movements to be successful, the depth of the solutions need to match the depth of the problems. That we must cultivate, we must meet the growing depth of hate and ignorance in our country with an overwhelming depth of wisdom and abiding love. And we must cultivate a depth within ourselves and our movements, which requires us to engage in a depth of practice and a depth of strategy. So movement leaders today are doing the impossible because they are cultivating that depth within themselves and within their organizations and within their communities. And that's rippling across the globe and transforming all of us in the process. Because we are facing a set of interconnected systemic problems, which is making it more difficult for most of us to get by, while power stagnates and accumulates in the hands of a fewer and fewer number. And because those problems are deep and interconnected, the solutions that our communities are generating are equally deep and equally connected. And we see this in the emerging transformative movements. There's a recognition that in fact there are a core set of values that are at the heart of the crises we face. And alternatively, there are a shared and unifying set of values embedded in the solutions that are emerging in distributed and disorganized ways, but very aligned ways across the different movement communities we see across the margins of the US and across the margins of the globe. This revolution in values at the heart of a great transition that is underway in our world is a transition from a world organized around the values of greed and domination and extraction to a world organized around the principles of love and care and community and connection and regeneration and resilience in a recognition of our interdependence. This revolution in values, as Dr. King called it, is pointing us towards the transformation of our society as the old is dying and the new is struggling to be born. But for our society to transform, we need our movements to mirror that transformation with as much and as greater depth. And today's movements are making big leaps by doing just that. Movements are rediscovering and reinventing a transformational approach to movement building. Because movements impact all aspects of our lives, from our culture to our policy to the structures to a basic sense of who we are and what is possible, movements help to transform both hearts and minds and systems and structures. And in that way, they're one of the only ways for a society to fundamentally transform at all levels. And within this, we see that transformation processes are essentially mirroring processes. To transform our society, we have to transform our movements. To transform our movements, we have to transform ourselves. And this is the way that movements are able to impact and affect all levels of human experience simultaneously, which is one of their unique characteristics. The second core dimension of movement building that make movements truly transformational is that movements are not about small incremental change alone. Transformational strategy is the process that allows us to shift reality and shift our experience exponentially to make big leaps. As we are working to transform our world, the questions that we explore as movement builders is how do we transition our movements and organize ourselves around the values that are at the heart of our vision? How do we mirror those values in everything that we do? Transformational movements are emerging in this moment because they're doing exactly that. Through embodying the four core elements of transformational movement building. Audacious and bold vision. Deep embodiment of that vision. Building the radical connections and deep community that's needed to sustain us as we move towards the vision. And on the basis of all of that, once all of that is in place, finding ways to adapt and navigate flexibly towards the vision that we share. Visioning a future that we actually want is not utopian. Transformational vision reweaves the rooted vision of the past. It reconnects us to the best of who we are and all our ancestors have given to us, and gives us a clear sense of the realities of the present. And from there, we can truly see transformative possibility that we can step into with boldness and courage. To embody what is core of the vision, movements are identifying the unconscious habits and patterns and beliefs that are limiting us and are building new muscles and developing new capacities through a set of intentional and systemic practices that help us to access our full individual and collective power. And at their heart, movements are simply about people and our relationships to each other, our relationships to the planet, and our relationships to all living things with whom we share the web of life. Through deep listening, breakthrough conversations, cultivating radical connections, movements are taking courageous action and making big leaps that put love at the center of everything we do and everything we are. A powerful example of an emerging transformative movement is the movement for food justice and food sovereignty, which you're going to hear a lot more about soon from Navina. This movement is so critical because everyone eats. But we don't all think about where our food comes from, the soil that that food was grown in, the workers who tended that food, who brought it to our table, who may have prepared it and served it to us. Many of us are disconnected from the most basic aspects of life, our food and the people and the land that make it possible. And many of the people who do that most essential critical work with great love and care, who are sustaining our lives, live at the margins of our society and at the margins of our community. And we have a powerful food movement emerging in this country that is only powerful because it figured out how to put those people who are at the margins of our food at the center of their movement, who pivoted from a fragmented and incremental change approach and unified around a big, bold vision for fundamental transformation in our food system. And in doing so, they united the different parts of the fragmented food movement into a beautiful caterpillar. And then they realized that caterpillar alone would never be strong and powerful enough to transform the injustice of our food system. So they reached out to everyone who eats, to all the people who don't think about themselves as food people, but who care about human beings and want healthy food for all. And that caterpillar is in the process of transforming into a butterfly, which Navina is going to tell you a lot more about. So with radical vision and deep embodiment and radical connection, it makes possible the ability to navigate adaptively and strategically towards vision and purpose in which a world that we're coming into is one with much more uncertainty and much more change. And so our ability to strategically navigate is much more important than it's ever been. And many of us have been in a process of creating strategic plans or trying to think about how to get to our impact. But what we're really talking about with strategic navigation is the ability to do that much more strategically and adaptively in real time as we cross rivers and oceans and summit mountains in the midst of changing conditions. So transformative movements are using vision and purpose to navigate adaptively towards a future we can't fully see within changing conditions, and are moving with those who are ready in synchronous ways to climb great mountains and make big leaps. Transformative movements are powerful because they're working to keep everything under the sun whole as we work collectively towards creating a new world with a deep recognition of our interdependence. Movements have their power because they're connected to our sense of the whole, which is why we understand that it's as long as anyone is left out and left behind, none of us can thrive, none of us are safe, none of us can be free, which is why we have to notice who are the people who we've left out and left behind and put to the margins of our society. And which is why when we bring those people to the center of the circle and we listen deeply, we start to see the whole in ways that allow us to generate solutions for the whole. And movements are powerful because they're purposeful ecosystems. And that wholeness comes into full bloom in moments like the Climate March, where you could sort of see a social movement in all of its diversity and dimensions, with indigenous communities and frontline communities literally at the front of the march, leading the rest of the movement forward. And at its essence, deep in the heart of all of this, again, it's simply about us. It's about people in our relationships. And that's why we're so happy to be here with you today and to be in this dialogue. We are living in a transformational moment exactly because visionary leaders and communities who are embodying the changes that they seek are finding ways to navigate and adapt and lead in this unprecedented historical moment. And this is something we can all practice to be a part of as this global transformation unfolds and is moving us towards a new world and a new future.
Thank you so much, Taj, for the transformative movements. This was an overview and their practices and stories associated with each of these four elements. And over the next several webinars, we will be going deeper into each of those elements in each of those webinars. So we're excited to have you join us, and we'll be laying out the schedule and reminding you how to connect with us next time. So with us next, we have an amazing movement builder from a sister movement in the food justice movement, Navina Khanna. And she is the director of the Heal Food Alliance, which stands for Health, Environment, Agriculture, and Labor. Navina and the Heal Food Alliance and their many allies have artfully and boldly woven these 4 elements of transformative movement building: vision, embodiment, radical connection, and strategic navigation. And they're taking the country by storm and made a big splash at the various political scene over the summer. So Navina, welcome, and tell us how HEAL got started.
Sure, thanks for Mimi. And I am really happy to be here with all of you. I'm very inspired by what I know about the move to end violence, and look forward to more and more cross-learning between our movement sectors. So just to tell you a little bit about how HEAL got started, when I first started in food and agriculture in the late 90s, most of the conversations, most of the conferences, most of the organizations, they were all dominated by white, upper middle class folks, and mostly folks were operating in silos. So I entered through sustainable agriculture, and in that field, equity and access for low-income people and people of color were often deemed irrelevant to the conversation. Farmers and farm workers were being pitted against each other. I moved to Oakland and I started working on food justice issues here, and found that there was very little interest or understanding of ecological issues. And the conversations about access to good food rarely included economic justice or building wealth in low-income communities. And meanwhile, we're seeing that things for people of color were and are getting worse, right? They're saying now that 1 in 2 kids of color will develop diabetes in their lifetime, and 6 of the 8 worst paying jobs right now are food system jobs. And we're still seeing a corporate concentration of our food system grow. Like 5 companies control our grocery stores, 4 control the meat industry, and the recent merger of Bayer and Monsanto means that 1 company will control more than half of the world's seeds. So we knew that if this was going to change, we needed a much more powerful movement, right? We needed one that could align across issues, and one that centered the struggles of those who are facing the most negative consequences of our current food system, and grounded in the solutions that they're leading. So about 5 years ago, I started mapping the food movement, right? Mapping various food and agriculture efforts, looking at where there were silos, where there were divisions, where there were fractures, and looking at where there was leadership and what was missing, where there were actually gaps in leadership. And with that ecosystem mapping project, I started convening circles of leaders. So with the support of Movement Strategy Center, we were able to bring together leaders from across different sectors to root across their experiences and in a shared vision for transformation. Taj talked about the importance of grounding in values, and that's really what we did, talking about the values that guide us and that shape our vision for the future. And what resulted from that is the HEAL Food Alliance. So it's the first cross-sector coalition of organizations that are working toward food and farm justice, and we're a multiracial alliance with all of our leadership from people of color, bringing together a whole movement around a long-term vision for change, shared campaign work, and shared communications. I can't hear you, Mimi.
Thank you, Navina. So you and your fellow conspirators really have done an amazing job of bringing leadership from the margins to the center. And now you're shifting the debate and leading in a way that brings everyone, and not just the margins, but everyone, towards new possibilities. Tell us how you made that pivot.
Oh yeah, we're certainly trying to do that. I remember a moment for myself where my understanding of what needed to be centralized in food and agriculture shifted. So about 5 years ago, I organized a commemoration of the 50-year anniversary of the Freedom Rides. We were focused on food. We called it the Food and Freedom Rides. And we traveled across the country meeting with leaders in the South and in the Midwest and in California, folks who were implementing real solutions in their own communities. In Iowa, we stopped to talk to workers at a Tyson plant. And these workers were facing wage theft and repetitive stress injuries, and when their bodies were broken from the work, they faced job loss. And it's centuries later and conditions are different, but the exploitation of their bodies was reminiscent of chattel slavery. And I realized that if conditions were to change, workers had to have the power to lead that change. There are 20 million people that work in the food system, so That's a lot of people who are facing these consequences and a lot of leadership for us to tap into. And so HEAL is grounded in that idea, right? It's anchored by a handful of organizations, including leadership from the Food Chain Workers Alliance, from Real Food Generation, the Union of Concerned Scientists, and the newly forming National Black Food and Justice Alliance. And we frame all of our work around a set of values that that the work needs to be, led by frontline communities, that it's going to take all of us to make this change, and again, holding that life is the most sacred thing. So together, one of the first things that we set out to do as a group that had formed was to co-create a 10-point platform with policy proposals at a local, state, and federal level for each of the 10 points that are part of our platform. We brought together 50 organizations from different sectors and who represent different constituencies to co-create this platform. And it gets at a whole host of issues, including economic justice, sustainable farming practices, corporate control of our food system. And it starts out with building power for workers, and weaves that into all of our policy proposals around food and agriculture so that farmers and workers are no longer pitted against each other. And it also contextualizes Black and Native land loss and ongoing racial injustices so that it addresses those in all of the planks too. We've had a year together of conversations and of cross-politicization, and these groups have been able to come together around a platform that essentially says it's not about my issue or about your issue, but about all of our issues if we're going to change our food system. So for the first time ever, we have a cohesive platform for the food movement. And the end result is framing the changes that we need in a historical context around corporate control and around racial oppression. And all of the groups who are involved in the development of the platform agreed to center workers first and lead with that as a foundation for change. So we're seeing some shift there.
Thanks, Navina, and congratulations. In a very short amount of time, you guys have made just a splash and a big impact. And so just to peel back the curtain a little bit, Movement Strategy Center has had the honor of working with you behind the scenes. And I just want to see if you can just give us a flavor of the hard work it took to actually weave those 4 elements: vision, embodiment, radical connection, so that you could actually navigate strategically.
Yeah, and I would say that, so much of it is about really rooting in the relationships and really rooting in a shared set of values, right? So being able to come together and have deep listening with one another, really have the hard conversations with each other when we have gotten to places where we're not clear, like what do you actually believe? Like, regardless of what we're putting out into the world, what we're actually communicating on a website or in the media or anything like that, like what do we as human beings actually believe? What are our core values that are important to us and to our families and to our communities? Being able to really root in that and being able to use that as the foundation and the navigation for how we develop any kind of external facing documents, how we facilitate our meetings, how we bring people together in their whole selves. And knowing that we're all, we all eat, we all have done, most people actually have at some point worked in the food system, so have some understanding of that, whether it's restaurant work or whatever, but just being able to ground in our own experiences, our own realities, and our own values, and really have those hard conversations and really push each other to make sure that we're coming from the same place as we move any of our campaign work forward to.
Thanks, Navina, and having action cooking it to people in their backyards. I know how much work and love you put into your movement building work. And a final question, then we're going to open it up to the rest of the folks on the webinar. So what is different now because of this big pivot you've made?
Yeah, so it's all still a process, of course, but we are running a couple of different campaigns right now that are grounded in this cross-sector approach. So one is a translocal campaign where we're organizing for municipalities to commit to purchasing policies that they will only buy from companies that meet a certain set of standards around workers and the environment and health and supporting local economies, including local agriculture. And a couple of cities have already signed on, and we expect 3 more to sign on this year. We're seeing local organizations and national organizations from different sectors get on board with this kind of campaign, which has been great just to see that that conversation and people being able to align their resources in that way. The other one is a call for presidential candidates to talk about food and farming issues. So we're in that set of work, including affordability, support for workers, for small farmers, public health, dealing with confined animal feeding operations, and curbing the corporate takeover of the food system at the same time. And that campaign is as much about the candidates as targets as it is about politicizing the food movement, right? So that we're actually building that power and we're holding decision makers accountable, and eventually, you know, we'd love to be running our own leaders for office. And those campaigns that we're already running and any future campaigns that we're considering right now are all grounded in our shared platform. So we're at the point now where national thought leaders are including food workers issues, and racial justice is a part of more and more of the conversations about food and agriculture. Today, if someone hosts a conference or a talk or puts out a media piece, leaders are no longer considered credible if they don't include those issues, or that there's no leadership from the front lines in those places. So we know that there's still a lot of work to make the changes that we want more politically possible, but we're seeing a significant shift in how resources, organizational resources, and human resources are aligned for food systems transformation through that work.
Thank you so much, Navina, and please stay on board. We're going to be asking you and Taj, opening it up to questions. But Navina, thank you so much for being an inspiring sister movement to many of the movements that are on this webinar now, and for just modeling what it takes to just take center, emanate from there, and to govern in a way that's for everyone.
Thanks for all of your support and for having me.
Thanks. So before we get into Q&A, I just want to highlight that for each of our webinars, we've created tools to help support you to apply some of these concepts and practices to your work. And you can download these practice guides from the Move to End Violence website. So for today, we are offering a reflection on margins to center. This is a core practice of movement building, and it's prioritizing the experiences and leadership of those directly impacted by systems of domination and extraction. And it keeps our movement building grounded in real experience rather than abstract ideas and assumptions. Be sure to download from there. So we have 4 questions and answers, and we are going to take some and we're going to be going.
Here's one in the Q&A box.
So we're going to look at the Q&A box. And someone asked, centering marginalized folks and the most affected is crucial. How do we balance this with the fact that movement building is hard work that isn't compensated? How are we supporting folks after we invite them into the center?
I have an interesting story about that. So in working with the environmental movement, which if you look at different movement sectors, one of the things you find is that philanthropy is very much a part of the structure of the dominant society. So the patterns of inequality that exist within the broader society also exist within philanthropy, which means in every issue you go into, in every sector you go into, you'll find organizations that are larger and wider tend to access a much larger percentage of the resources within that sector. So in the environmental movement, if you look at some studies that have been done that have shown that about 1 to 3% of the resources, of all of the resources that go into environmental work, go into communities of color, go into frontline communities, go to the communities that are being hit hardest and worst by environmental impacts. And if you look across every sector, you see that pattern repeating pretty consistently. So as we work with others in the environmental movement to try to figure out, one, how the environmental movement can have more impact, because one of the consequences of that resource inequity is that movements fail to create deep and structural change. That inequity allows movements to make tiny, small, incremental, and inconsequential changes, but if you want to change the society at a deep level, the resources have to be more democratically distributed, meaning the people who are facing the problems need access to the financial resources to solve the problem. So out of that emerged an initiative called the Building Equity and Alignment for Impact Initiative, which brings together grassroots environmental groups, large environmental organizations, and funders to figure out how the environmental movement can have more impact. And it starts with equity. And equity means the people who are solving the problems on the front lines of the problems actually have to have the financial resources to solve them, right? So that's the equity part. The alignment part, which you were talking about, Navina, is there an agreement around the shared values that unify folks in a movement about how we define success, the depth of change we're seeking, and what we're moving towards? And it's interesting because in some places, the alignment part is easier because people just have to agree. The equity part is harder because the way that resources are allocated has to fundamentally shift. And without equity, alignment is sort of rhetorical and irrelevant. So I just want to affirm that the resource disparities, not just within the ways that jobs and income are distributed, but the way that resources are organized within the third sector, within philanthropy and nonprofits, that resource inequity also has to shift in order to create the capacity to impact the inequity in the broader society. So, long story long, but it's one of the central problems we face in the challenge of bringing margins to center.
But maybe I can also share a little bit from Heal's experience, which is that, you know, margins are only at center if allies actually organize around centering margins, right? And one of the things that we've seen, and it's not every organization, but one of the things we've seen is some of the bigger organizations that have access to more resources actually stepping up to the plate and saying, you know, we have relationships with funders, or we have relationships with the media, or we have just access to resources that historically marginalized communities don't, and actually using their social capital to allocate resources to our work. We've seen that with one of our core anchors in the Heal Food Alliance, and at the same time, when we're thinking about how the work gets done, instead of just trying to, you know, build a whole new structure, we're thinking about who are the best organizations to actually lead this work, and how do we use any resources that we get to actually fund that work to happen and fund those organizations to do it.
Great. So Rebecca Klein has a question. I have heard the term deep listening frequently in this webinar and other learning venues. What exactly does it mean to listen deeply? What are the practices of a deep listener? What does it look and sound like?
Yeah, I mean, I know for myself, I know when I'm not deep listening, which is when I feel like there's something I gotta say and I really want to be heard. Whenever I feel that way, I know I'm not listening very deeply. So especially if so it's like, I'm just making this up as I'm talking right now, because I think it's like a recognition that one, there's enough time and space for each of us to be heard. Deep listening, like many of the things we do, is rooted in a notion of abundance. Like there's enough for all of us. Like there's enough, as Gandhi said, there's enough for all of our need, but not enough for any of our greed. Right? There's more than enough time, there's more than enough resources, there's more than enough space. And if we come together from that assumption, then I can take the time to really hear and listen to what Navina has to say. Because the other idea embedded in deep listening is that our well-being is linked. So if Navina needs something, I really need to listen, because if Navina's not okay, I'm not okay. So there's a sense of the practice of deep listening in this culture, because our culture is so individualistic and competitive, and the notion that, you know, I've got this idea and it's really, really important, but actually it's like really more important to know that we're connected, and we're hearing each other and we're feeling each other, because if we're not, none of us are going to be okay.
Right.
So,
and I think part of it is also knowing like that time and space is like, we're in it for the long haul, right? So if we don't actually take the time and space to address the things that need to be addressed, we're never going to get anywhere different in a year or 3 years or 5 years, right? So I can give an example. Actually, recently, Heal hosted a meeting a few months ago to bring together about a dozen leaders who do work around corporate control of the food system to talk about what's the campaign that we need to be working on together. And what kept coming up was a conversation that I've heard a sentence or two of for as long as I've been in food and agriculture, but I know that it's been a fracture and a struggle in the food and agriculture movement since the 80s. And so at some point during our meeting, we decided actually we're never going to get to a shared campaign and be able to work towards shared goals unless we actually hear this whole story of where the hurt is, where folks have not been heard before, and take the time to actually all understand what the issue has been, so we can get to a place where we can move forward from that place together. Like, we need to all be able to share the hurt, and we need to all be able to share that history, and we need to all be able to acknowledge it in a way that we can move forward together if we're going to actually change something.
Thanks, Navina. And you bring up a great point, which is deep listening in and of itself can be huge. So thank you. A question for you guys about movement ecosystems. That term has been used a lot, and wanted to see if you can explain what that is and to ground that in specifics and examples.
Sure. So I used that term to talk about the mapping that I did, looking at the ecosystem of different issue areas that people work in, different sectors, different kinds of approaches that people take to food and agriculture work. But of course, all of our movements are connected, right? It's not just about food and agriculture or about climate or about gender. All of these things are interconnected. But doing that mapping for me was a way to be able to look at where the relationships are or where they aren't between those different issue areas and those different sectors. And in the process of doing that, the map that I did, the report is called Field to Forest, because what I was looking at was the fact that, like, folks are working in silos right now in a kind of monoculture kind of way, but how do we get to a way of working where we're actually seeing our issues as interconnected and seeing the different roles that each of us can play in a whole ecosystem, that we don't all have to be doing the same thing, but that we can use each of our skills and resources to move all of the work forward. And I think, Taj, I'd love to hear your perspective on this, but one of the things that was really helpful for me when I was doing that is that if I would come to Taj with a place where I was struggling and looking at the dynamics in the food and agriculture movements, you would be able to say, like, well, here's this story from this other movement, or this from this other movement, and here are the shapes of those relationships. Here's how that ecosystem was. Is that what your ecosystem is like right now? And it helps me be able to see that whole picture a little bit better.
Yeah. I think for those of you who know something about ecology, one of the core principles of ecology is really about the importance and the quality and the nature of relationships between things. Like, the relationships are almost a thing unto themselves. And kind of, you think about that, it's like, there's you, there's me, and there's a relationship as the third thing. Like, that's a real thing. And so in a culture that is very individualistic, right, we tend in our social change work to think about organizations as individuals in individualistic ways. And then we ignore the importance and significance of our relationships. So the reason why ecosystem approaches are so important is because we can't understand how we're stuck, and we can't understand how to generate deeper, more transformational change unless we understand the nature of our relationships, and unless we're building relationships in which what we do together is greater than the sum of the parts. What we do together is more than we could do alone, because the problems that we face require us to take that approach to what we're doing.
Thank you both so much for that. We have a question from Tony Stillday. She says, I work for a tribal nation, and one of the issues I face in my work is the issue of equity versus sovereignty. Can you please talk about this?
Yeah.
You should probably be talking about it. I wish you could turn your mic on, but we'll try. Navina's got
No, I mean, I think that's like the crux of, like, how do we get to a place where the change that we actually want is politically possible, right? So for us, when we think about, like, food and agriculture, so much of that is about a land base, right? And how like, who works the land and who controls the land and who controls resources. And right now, we know that we have a system of private property ownership that puts profit above everything else. And in the kinds of changes that we would actually want to see, we want to see a lot more community governance and community control over the resources that affect all of our lives, like land and water and food and seeds and things like that. So I think that it's a really tricky thing to figure out how do we work within the current political systems to push towards making what we want more politically possible. And I think that part of the importance of being able to see our whole movement ecosystem is being able to also look at how do we start to assert what we really want, and who can play the role of asserting the furthest thing we really want, and who can play the roles of moving things within what's politically possible right now. Like, what are the different roles for each of us to play in that? And I think there's this very real question of how do we actually get towards sovereignty?
Yeah.
I don't have that one answered.
Yeah, I think the way we get towards it is just through the assertion of what is true, and it's just that that we do what is right. And if we're gonna have a future that's going to work for all in this country, we have to definitely account for our 3 founding sins, which are slavery, genocide, and misogyny. So any solution that is a deep and fundamental solution to the future of this country has to acknowledge, listen to, and repair the harm of that original sin in ways that are deeply whole and interconnected. And so the question of returning and restoring the rights of the caretakers of the land to their proper place in relationship to the caretaking of the land is something that we all must insist upon until it becomes the way in which we are organized. Because the rules of the current system are what has generated the current crisis. And we cannot use the rules of the current system to resolve the crisis, which is why we're in this moment of breakdown and fracture, both within the US and globally, because this system is coming to an end. It is in its last gasps. And the question is, can we, those who live and connect through our shared commitment to love and wholeness and interdependence, can we build something new and better? That's really the only question. This system is going to collapse. Can we build something new and better? That is the only question. To do that, we must repair the harm. We must make reparations. We must repair relationships. And so that is the only pathway to a regenerative, restorative world.
Yeah, and I think when we think about like what wealth looks like in our communities and what we're moving towards, a lot of that work is being able to reclaim spaces around sharing food, right? Or saving our rainwater, or all of these ways that we're able to assert community control over spaces and reclaim our own traditions too. So much of that has been stripped away in this process, right? And being able to root in those values of community relationship and community relationship with land.
And one thing just to note, because I think the equity sovereignty question may have spoken to this, is that, and many racial justice activists who aren't Indigenous don't quite realize this, but there are ways in which civil rights laws, which we fought for, are used against Indigenous and Native communities in this country to undermine their assertion of sovereignty. And there's more learning that's happening around that as Black Lives Matter movement and other movements start to build more intentional and deeper relationships with Indigenous struggles. But racial justice folks in this country, I think, we have a lot to learn about the ways in which the victories that we've won have been used against our Indigenous brothers and sisters here. And it's a place where we need to not just learn, but figure out some new approaches to that.
Thank you so much for the question and for the beginnings of some answers. We have time for just a couple more questions, and really appreciate the community of folks who've been sending your questions. So second to last question is, share success stories around navigating equity around funding in an alliance or network.
Well, I'm going to talk about Navina, because I think HEAL is one of the really interesting examples. Because within HEAL, you both have frontline communities, worker organizations, and you have large environmental organizations who've traditionally not partnered well and worked well with those frontline groups. And in the HEAL Alliance, the sort of big, large organization that's a part of that coalition, part of the role they're playing is using their access to help bring resources to frontline communities that frontline communities wouldn't otherwise be able to access. And not to say that that's always smooth or easy, but because I think they did the work around kind of building relationship around core values, that those who have access to power and privilege institutionally are finding ways to leverage their privilege to create more resource equity. I would say, go to the Be for Impact website, Building Equity for Alignment. I think it's a really powerful model for that. MSC has a tool and approach called the Blueprint Collaborative. So if you go to blueprintcollaborative.org, that's a process and a mechanism to help frontline communities organize themselves into networks and alliances as a way to access resources more collectively. Because one of the challenges that small organizations face is, as a small independent organization, not in a network, not in an alliance, it's very, very hard to access resources when you're not in community. So building the kind of communities that allow frontline organizations and marginalized communities to access resources collectively, to mobilize for resources collectively, is essentially the core aspect of it. And at some point, there's a whole set of work around the new economy, which is about how our communities generate our own set of assets and how those assets can finance our social change work in ways in which we're less dependent on Wall Street. Because philanthropy, unfortunately, is just a wing of Wall Street. It is a subdivision of Wall Street. And so it is not so helpful for deep social change to have most of our social change capacity attached to a subdivision of Wall Street. We all do our best to make the most of that situation, but our communities need to control and manage their own assets towards their own self-determination and destiny. So that's the future of hopefully where that process will go.
And I'm actually going to pivot into our last question because we only have a couple more minutes. So the question is, how do we pivot ourselves and to help others from an individual mindset to an ecosystem mindset? And I want to encourage you guys to give both mundane examples to big examples.
Well, it's funny because sometimes we call individualism the lie of separation, right? It's a myth that I can exist alone by myself on an island, and somehow my existence is not completely dependent upon a whole network and web of relationships that make me possible. So individualism is fundamentally a cultural myth. It is a lie, and it is a lie from which most of the violence that we see in the world that is structural is rooted in that lie. So the challenge is to just notice and see the truth. Like, we're here, we're sharing the same air, we're sharing the same space. Like, what you do is affecting me, what I do is affecting you. So just noticing the truth of our interdependence and asking ourselves, and listening for, how do I honor the ways in which we are connected? How do I notice the ways in which our relationship is generating well-being? How do I notice the ways in which our relationship may be generating harm because of my lack of awareness, because of for whatever reason? So I think in some ways, the good thing we have to do is just pay attention to how things actually work, and to know that we've been living in a story that is fundamentally rooted in a lie. And and just listen to your grandma, listen to your there are people, lots of people, communities that never believe the lie, and they have remained grounded and connected into what is true. So I know what I do is I reconnect to those people who don't forget very, very often the truth of how we're connected. So there's lots of support all around.
Yeah, I think that's real in all of our relationships and all of our lives, and I think that there are ways that we can do that in movement too, right? That we can, if we go through an exercise just of uncovering what are the root causes of why we are where we are, we get to individualism and capitalism, and individualism being some of the things that shape our culture and keep perpetuating this myth. But I think that there are also ways that we can, and we saw this with our food justice strategy circles. I've seen a little bit of this in the tiny glimpses that I've had with the Move to End Violence, but even just coming to a place where we're able to acknowledge what our shared story is, looking at where we are now, looking at where we've been, looking at where we're trying to go together, and really being able to articulate together what our shared values are, and what it means to be in relationship with each other in an authentic way. And that's not just like a sign on to somebody else's thing, but that it's actually about, we're in this, we care about the same things, how can we do this work together as We need each other to do this work.
Great. And sadly, we are at time for our Q&A and about to end our time together. Thank you so much, Taj and Navina, for sharing your thoughts, and to all of you on the webinar for sharing your brilliant questions. Thank you so much for joining us. And as we mentioned earlier, this is the first webinar. This was an overview of what we mean by transformative movement building. And each of the following 5 webinars will go deeper into an element. And this has been presented by the Movement Strategy Center and the Move to End Violence in a deep collaboration from our deep partnership together. The next webinar is October 4th, Tuesday, and it will focus on one of the key elements, purpose and vision. So please join us on October 4th and visit www.movetoendviolence.org for more details and to register. So again, this webinar has been recorded. A link will be emailed to all registrants, and you can visit the website to request the link and download the practice guides that were featured on today's call. So finally, this is the first of our 6 webinars on the topic. I'd love to hear your feedback so we can learn and improve. We have a short feedback form that you can access in the chat box, and this link will also come to you by email. So thank you everyone from around the world, including someone from Switzerland. Thank you for building beloved community virtually with us, and we hope to see you back here for a future webinar. Thanks so much and have a great day.